Okay, everyone, welcome to today's webinar from the LEDS Global Partnership. I appreciate everyone's time. Today we're going to be talking about the rise of non-state actors in low-emission development initiatives. I'm very lucky to have some of the latest research here on the table presented to us. My name is Scott Muller, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the working group on subnational integration within the LEDS Global Partnership, and I'll be moderating this session here today. By way of introduction now, I think it's important to point out that in order to leverage some of the greatest greenhouse gas emission reductions possible, there's really two parallel strategic tracks at the international level that we can discern right now in the approach to COP21. The first is this real innovative, I think, ex-ante process whereby our national governments are submitting their INDCs, their intended nationally determined contributions. And these INDCs will play a key role in framing, I think, the details of COP21's principal objective, which is to create the legally binding and universal agreement on climate. But concurrently, there is this very appreciable second stream of activities that highlights the role of subnational governments, the private sector, and civil society to implement these additional climate actions and drive new partnerships and green growth, effectively jumping the implementation gap that some people call it. So today, some of the latest research around the globe is on the table, and that's been the hard work of two individuals who are with us today. The first, Dr. Philip Patberg, who's the professor of transnational environmental governance and the deputy head of the Department of Environmental Policy for the Institute of Environmental Studies at the University of Amsterdam. And within the Netherlands, at the Research School for Socioeconomic and Natural Sciences and the Environment, he coordinates this research cluster on global environmental governments and politics. He's also the chair of the board of the Global Environmental Change section of the German Political Science Association, and he's a senior research fellow of the International Earth System Governance Project. In addition, Oscar Weiderberg is with us. He's a researcher at the Institute for Environmental Studies as well at the University of Amsterdam, where he works on fragmentation and global governance, global climate policy, and network theory. And he's published a great deal of work on climate clubs, some of which we'll talk about today, city and company climate actions and public-private partnerships. He's worked with UNFCCC. He's a research fellow of the Earth System Governance and a core member of the Connect project, which you can find out about at fragmentation.eu. The LEDS Global Partnership now is divided up into three priority regions. And since its launch in 2011, the initiative has really grown to include this very active participation of more than 140 governmental and international institutions. And within this global partnership, the thematic working group on subnational integration was created in 2013 to support learning and facilitate collaboration and between national and subnational governments for an accelerated and effective climate actions. Within the working group on subnational integration, we provide targeted remote expert assistance on LEDs upon request via the REAL service. And over the past 2 years, we've realized several activities, including organizing panels at multiple regional and global events and forums. We've hosted these peer learning discussions. We've published a lot of reports that are available at the ledsgp.org website. Right now, I'm in Lima, Peru, where we've just finished up a really forward-thinking seminar in partnership with the Ministry of Environment in Peru on the road to COP21, where the LEDS LAC regional platform hosted a discussion on the challenges and opportunities to link national and subnational efforts to accelerate sustainable urban transportation in Latin America and Caribbean. And that had the strong participation of the governments of Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, with city officials from Medellin and Rosario and Buenos Aires, Lima. So there, a lot of great discussions on the table. So some house cleaning here real quick before the presentation starts. The webinar control panel on the right or the left of your screen is actually a very powerful tool. And within it, you can see the handouts. We've uploaded some handouts that are relative to today's discussion. There's a chat feature that you can see to send messages to the whole group or just private individuals and colleagues that you may have recognized. There's also a button there for questions. And, you know, this is quite a comprehensive presentation today, so it's great during the presentation to actually go ahead and upload your questions. Then what we're going to do at the end of Oscar and Philip's presentation is I will come back to moderate a round of questions that have been submitted during this discussion. What we'll do there at the end is have a small poll as well on today's webinar, and I believe there's actually a prize with today's poll, so please stay and answer some of the poll questions. And with that, I'm quite proud to hand this off to Philip and Oscar. Guys?
So, hi everyone. My name is Oscar Widerberg. I will try to get this one. My name is Oscar Widerberg, as Scott said, and I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm sitting next to Professor Philip Patsberg here in Amsterdam at the Institute for Environmental Studies. And what we are going to try to present to you today is actually results from a number of ongoing projects on climate initiatives, transnational climate initiatives involving non-state actors, you know, such as cities, such as regions, such as companies. The majority of the work that we're doing is funded by the Dutch scientific organization, but I also want to mention another project that we're part of throughout this year, under which some of our work is done, and that's under a Swedish NGO, Forest, which has gathered this very interesting reference group on climate, international climate policy, where we work together with some Swedish companies, ministries, and NGOs, and trying to create this dialogue on non-state actors and what they can actually mean up to Paris. So what you will hear today, we will also work further on and present in a larger report when we get to Paris. So how we're going to do this presentation is that after this, I'm going to hand over to Philip, who is going to give you a kind of a background and introduction to our research. Then I will come back into the picture and give you some of our results on the main results, let's say, on what some of these actors are doing, for example, cities and regions, and then talk about companies. Then Philip is going to come back again and give you some information or some results that we have on multi-stakeholder partnerships, and then finish off with a wrap-up, the major conclusions that we have drawn so far, and then we will hopefully have some time for Q&A. So with this, I'm going to hand over to Philip.
Yeah, welcome also from my side. Very excited to be part of this webinar. Let's jump right into the action. Non-state actors have featured prominently in recent debates. Scott has outlined the two strategies that we're witnessing. And we see this idea that non-state actors can be part of the solution to climate change, that they can feature prominently in bridging what many have identified as an emission gap up to 2020 and beyond. For example, in the recent Lima-Paris action agenda between the French presidency, the Lima presidency, and the UNFCCC, there's a mention of the important role of non-state actors in what is referred to as the fourth pillar of the upcoming discussions in Paris. And non-state actors have featured prominently in many debates among scientists and policymakers as a sort of silver bullet to indeed bridge what many believe to be a substantial gap in ambition. Now, you also see this at the level of various initiatives, just two examples here, which try to gather information on what non-state actors do, contributions from cities, companies, NGOs, research institutes, churches, and so on and so on. The Climate Initiatives platform, for example, run by the World Resource Institute and some scientific organizations, lists around 180 initiatives in which non-state actors feature prominently. There's also the NASCA, the Non-State Actor Zone for Climate Action, which came out of the Lima COP20, which is hosted by the United Nations Framework Convention Secretariat. And it's here on the slide. It currently features some 3,700 unique commitments from various actors, again, including regions, cities, investors, companies, on climate change mitigation. Now, this is all to say that there's a real attention to this. However, there's quite little hard evidence on what all of this involvement actually yields. Just as a matter of background, UNEP has estimated the potential of companies and subnational authorities to be around 2.9 gigatons annually. So this is 1/3 of the estimated emission gap up to 2020. So a sizable contribution could indeed come from actors which are not states and which are not necessarily at the table in Paris. Now, Oscar and I have for some time now doing research on this phenomenon, and we will present to you some results that we have gathered. This shows you the cumulative increase of all sorts of non-state and multi-stakeholder initiatives on climate governance, in particular mitigation. So really see this as a phenomenon that picked up in the new millennium, and it's not just after the failure of Copenhagen in 2009 that this has emerged. It's really something that we see for a decade now, 15 years. Now, I'd like to start to get a bit more into the juicy bits by presenting this so-called governance triangle. Essentially, what you see here is 80 initiatives, including the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol, but also many of those that we have discussed and that we will discuss today, initiatives which bring together various actors. So that's why it's a triangle: the public, including cities, the profit side, the firms, and the non-profit side, civil society, and the various mixes of those actors when they come together to form substantial climate change mitigation action. Now, what all of these 80 in this triangle have in common, and I advise you not to try to read the fine print here, so don't try to read all the acronyms. We'll come back to some of those in a second. What they all have in common is that these initiatives try to mitigate so emissions. They try to mitigate emissions. They have a global scope, and they include more than 2 actors, and they are not purely national. So they are initiatives which potentially are global in aspiration. Now, the interesting bit here is that this is quite a sizable sample, but when we go and start to look beyond those arrangements, they have individual members being part of them. So each of those arrangements has membership, which means that there are firms, cities, civil society organizations member to those, and this creates a sizable proportion of non-state activity, which I will refer to in a second. Now, just as a matter of example, some of those well-known ones, which in our sample, the C40 City Initiative, ClimateWise, which is the insurance industry's program, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the International Emissions Trading Association, REAP, and many more that are familiar. These are these initiatives where actors come together to take concrete climate action. Now, before we start with our analysis and we try to answer some of those questions, who is really participating, to what effect, what are the potential problems, I just want to start from plain numbers. So the overall sample that we present, these 80 arrangements within the triangle, unite more than 10,000 unique members. So in these 80 initiatives, we have 10,000 unique members, including cities and firms and so on, which is a quite sizable chunk of activity. I will run through these this donut very quickly, and I'm not sure why it's pink, but the biggest chunk is pink, and that's the cities. We find around 8,600 cities in our sample, around 1,300 companies, 196 states, so that's not so surprising, 86 research-related organizations, 68 NGOs, and some 40 international organizations, and 300 other individual actors, which include churches and national development banks. So in total, again, 10,000 actors that populate this governance architecture. So I think this is, on the one hand, really good news, because it shows that non-state climate action is not just a spurious phenomenon, it's really substantial. But of course, what we try to understand is what are the tangible effects and what can we actually learn about this phenomenon. Now I will hand over to Oscar, who will start to present some results on the first actor that we believe to be of crucial importance, which is cities that have joined in various global networks of cities to take concrete climate action.
Okay, thanks a lot, Philip. So now we're going to maybe walk a little bit, get a little bit more into the data that we have. So Philip gave you some of these very broad figures on how many we have, but what do they actually do, and where are they actually situated, and who are the most important actors? So these kind of questions have been driving our research when we are looking at non-state actors and trying to figure out what they're doing. So starting with cities and regions, right? So subnational authorities, right? So both cities such as Copenhagen or Malmö, but also regions such as California or New York. We look at three different things first. The first one is geographical distribution. We want to know basically where are they located, these thousands of actors that we have collected. Who are the most important actors, and how do we approach something as who is actually an important actor and what is important in this context? And the last thing we look at here is commitment. So starting with the geographical distribution, what we did is that we took 13 of these transnational city and regional networks working primarily or almost solely on climate change. So of course there are other networks out there, but not everyone is working on climate change primarily, but are working on sustainable development, for example. And what we did is that we took all the members to all this network and plotted them on a map. So here you see, on this slide, you see the result of that. There are, of course, also national networks, but we were primarily here interested in the transnational networks that are mainly mentioned in the UN context. And what you see is a quite clear picture of a cluttered kind of landscape around Europe, but also following the coastlines of the US, of the North American continent, but also a little bit on the in Southeast Asia. But in general, basically we see this dividing line between the north and south on cities and regions being active on climate in climate initiatives across borders, right? So this is the first kind of picture that surprised us, not maybe in the sense of being that thinking that this is a northern phenomenon, but maybe the size of it, and at least when it comes to these city networks and regional networks that are getting most of the attention, at least in international gatherings. So this was the first kind of revelation that we, for us, kind of came out of this research. The second thing we asked, so who are the most important actors? And here we turn to a methodology which is called network analysis. Basically what you do is you try to connect one actor with another, or in this case, what you have in front of you now is the result of taking all the actors that we had, all these cities and regions that we had in the 13 networks, connecting them to their institutions or to their networks, and then basically try to distill how many actors can we take away, how many cities and regions can we take away, and still keep all the institutions or all the networks connected to each other? How do we keep the whole network intact? Right? So what you see here in this picture is that I have two types of nodes. You have pink nodes, which are the networks, and you have gray nodes, which are the cities. And what you have immediately is you have around 45 nodes, 45 cities and regions that we call superconnectors, which are these connectors that are able to be part of more than one network. They're able to fill this bridging function of distributing information across different networks, across different groups of actors. And often what you see, if you look at this picture, you start to see kind of a few of these usual suspects. You have Barcelona, Malmö, Freiburg, for example, but also California, featuring as these superconnectors, being for us very important actors in this network of transnational city and regional climate initiatives. And you even have, you also have a division line, which is, I think, is quite clear and in a way maybe a bit obvious, but still it's interesting to see it, is to see this European kind of upper part and the American lower part, where you basically have cities on the top part and regions on the lower part. You also even have these very highly superconnected. So Vienna and Ile-de-France, for example, are these two actors which are able to connect regional and city networks. So then we moved on and said, look, we do see that there are a lot of actors out there. They are concentrated, but still they're doing something. We also see there's a lot of cities and regions that are part of several networks, and they can, what kind of function they have there is maybe a next step in the research. At least we start to see these patterns. But what are they actually committing to, right? So what we did is that we took the C40 as a kind of an illustrative case, and we went through city per city and tried to figure out, okay, so when they actually make these commitments to reduce their CO2 emissions, what are the baseline years that they use? When do they want to start counting? What are the target years? When do they want to reach their goals? And what is the ambition level? And this, I think, you will see now on your screens is a bit what happened when we did this exercise. And you start to see this real diverse landscape of base years, target years, and ambition levels. Where some have used 1990 as a starting year, moving up to target year 2050 and saying we're going to be 100% fossil-free, such as Stockholm. Others have started in 2010 and say by 2020, in 10 years, we're going to reduce our emissions with 75%. Now, this shows you some of the diverging, kind of the diverse picture that's out there when it comes to the commitments and the difficulties that comes later when, for example, comparing ambition levels and effectiveness, right? Also, what's interesting, what maybe this picture hides, is a bit that even if someone says, yes, we're going to reduce our emissions with 100% by 2050, such as Stockholm, it doesn't mean that everything in the whole city will be decarbonized, but it means, for example, with Stockholm's case, that yes, the public services will be decarbonized. So not only are the three indicators that we looked at diverging, but also the scope of the commitments are different. The last thing we looked at with cities was that how does the commitment actually hold up if you compare with the UNFCCC and what countries actually been doing. Because if we want cities to fill this gap as that Philip talked about, the ambition gap, then in a sense they need to be additional, right, to what the country has already promised. So what we did is that we looked at, first of all, which networks actually had quantitative commitments on a network level. Not saying that individual cities don't have it, but if you look at only at the network level, then we see that only 4 of the city networks that we included have quantitative commitments. We also see that only 2 of them, so the Covenant of Mayors here and the Climate Alliance, actually seem to go beyond what we took as a baseline or an indicative line on the UNFCCC benchmark. We would be around 11% for the countries. So it is quite rough estimates, but it does give you an indication of which city networks that are actually posing these kind of demands on their members, and how many that are not doing it. So having that said, we will return to some of the kind of conclusions and the meanings of this, but it does show you that yes, there are a lot of things happening, but when it comes to cities and regions, there's a very big diversity in what you can actually expect. Moving over to companies as the second subnational actor that we looked at, we wanted to pose the same kind of questions. We wanted to look at geographical distribution. We wanted to look at maybe here in the sectoral distributions, which sectors seem to be doing the most. Who are the important actors? What are the commitment levels, right? And here we can also talk about disclosure, which has been an interesting kind of feature when it comes to business and climate change over the last 5-10 years. So the first thing we did is that we looked at the geographical distribution. So here we took a sample. If you have down on your right, you see that we go back to this triangle that we had in the beginning, where we looked at, I think it was 5 or 6 transnational business initiative on climate change. So there are more companies involved, but when we look at the purely company-level initiatives, we found we use only 6 initiatives with about 660 companies. Now, plotting their geographical distribution in terms of company headquarters gave you the results that you see now on your screens. So, getting back to when you think about the city picture, we see a very similar picture here, like the United States, Japan, UK, so these European countries really kind of stand out as places where companies that engage in these transnational climate initiatives place their headquarters. Maybe there are many other reasons for this, it could be for tax reasons, for example, or whatever, what have you, but it does show you this picture that the companies that really engage in transnational climate governance are mainly based in the northern hemisphere. Then we looked at the sectoral distribution, and here we took the same sample. We tagged them per sector, and we get a very interesting picture here because you see that almost half of the sample belong to 3 major groups of sectors. So the first one is commercial services and supplies, it's retailers, and it's foods. So you do see these consumer goods companies mainly that are exposed to kind of their clients or the public, let's say, in a different way than maybe many others. That seems to be part of transnational climate initiatives. There's one maybe that stand out a bit, and that's the commercial services. And here we have a big sample of consultancies working actually to consult on climate change. And these are very good at also joining different types of initiatives. And that also gives you a different picture that it's not kind of external, independent companies that are not already working on climate change that are joining. These are actually companies that already benefit from this. And if we look at the most important actors, then for companies, it's slightly different than when it comes to cities and regions, because here we looked at a different thing. We looked at the total CO2 emissions of the companies involved. So we took, let's say, the major, here you see the major 12 or the major 20 companies part of our sample that when it comes to CO2 emissions. And you have the big utilities. You have Holcim, for example, a cementing company. You have some of the big oil and gas companies really being part of our sample and really showing the magnitude of and the potential of the companies that are part of global climate initiatives and business initiatives in particular. So it's again, as Philip said, it's not only by numbers but also by emission levels. It's a sizable proportion of companies that are part of these initiatives. And if you, just to give you some overview stats and some back of the envelope calculations, we have about, in our sample of just 600 city companies, they have a total of about 2.1 gigatons of CO2 emissions. If you calculate, and I can just tell you now already that about 25% of the companies in our sample reported on their emissions. Then if you take if you assume that 2.1 is 25%, you take that by 4, you get around 8.4% of gigatons of estimated yearly emissions, right, in the full samples, which accounts for almost 25% of global emissions 2014 levels, which is, even if we have a sample of the bigger population, it's a big part and has a big potential to have a good impact or a sizable impact. So let's move on a little bit to see what kind of commitments they're actually making. And an interesting feature was happening for us, especially for us researchers over the last half year, has been this startup of Nazca, right? So Nazca has, in a way, kind of you really made a lot of data accessible on what companies are committing to, right, and making it very easy to link on to registries, for example, like CDP, to see what levels of commitments that companies are doing, but also on what they're actually disclosing. So what we did to look at commitment levels is that we looked at Nazca about 2.5 months ago. I think it's updated somewhat now. But the sample that we had 2.5 months ago had about 1,157, so almost 1,160 commitments in total by companies, right? So again, we have 660 unique companies registered. It's not exactly the same as we had before in our previous sample, but they match up very well, showing some kind of triangulation in our data. But it shows, and it also shows that not all these commitments are made, not one commitment per company is made, but some companies make several commitments. And what we wanted to see is a little bit here, if we look at the commitments, what are they, how are they actually structured? So we asked 3 types of questions when we went through the commitments that companies made in Nazca. The first thing we asked, are they qualitative or are they quantitative? Is it a qualitative goal such as we support a price on carbon, for example? That's a typical qualitative target. Or is that a quantitative target? We will reduce our CO2 emissions in our supply chains with 25%, a quantitative target. So there we see that about 73% out of the commitments actually are quantitative, which might point you towards the idea that, at least give you an idea that at least we do have numbers to compare with. If the second thing we looked, are these commitments based on intensity targets? So saying, are we doing CO2 emissions per product, which in the end doesn't have to lead to an absolute or net reduction, but at least if you basically have amount of CO2 per unit of product. Or are they absolute? So they say we're going to, reduce our CO2 emissions on a total on the company like this. Or other, do they actually not have any, or can't they be attributed to intensity or absolute? And there we see kind of a 30-30-30 division, where we see that a large part of them are actually intensity targets. The last one we looked at is looking at if they're time-bound or not. So here we see that about 73% are time-bound, whereas 27% are not time-bound. And to get this picture together, what we would assume is that an absolute quantitative time-bound target would be, to us, the most optimal target or commitment. However, only 30% of the targets are structured like this. The final slide I have on commitments before, or on companies before handing back to Philip, is looking at levels of disclosure. So about 25% of the data set includes reports on CO2 emissions. A part of this is CDPs, part of this is GRI, part of this is actually in their reports, but many of the companies actually don't report on their CO2 emissions. And what we also see is that we have this kind of divergence again in the companies that disclose on their emissions. So for example, oil and gas industry is very good at disclosing their emissions compared to, for example, commercial services and supplies, which is, so you have this, you see the 3 biggest sectors actually have the lowest amount of percentage of firms actually disclosing their CO2 emissions. And you could argue that this is a way of, checking if a company is serious about their commitments, because at least you have to start measuring CO2 emissions before you can actually count it. I think I will leave it there and hand over to Philip to talk about the final type of actor.
Yeah, thanks, Oscar. I will now discuss multi-stakeholder partnerships. So these are initiatives which indeed take on board different kinds of actors. So in multi-stakeholder partnerships, you can have public actors, such as cities, for example, and companies and NGOs together. And this, of course, is an interesting institutional setup because, in theory, you bring together resources from different sectors that are all complementary, and you can achieve great things. We use similar indicators to discuss those multi-stakeholder partnerships: the geographical distribution, who are the important, relevant actors, and in the end, some lessons learned from previous research. That is because research on climate multi-stakeholder partnerships, at least in our project, is ongoing at the moment. So we will have results on that in a few months. So I will refer back to some older statistics. Now for the geographical distribution, in a sense, a very similar picture emerges. So we have 15 multi-stakeholder partnerships in our sample. On the bottom of the slide, you should be able to see again the triangle. And what we refer to here is the zone 7. That's indeed the zone of multi-stakeholder partnerships where public, profit, and non-profit are brought together. So 15. And what we've done here is simply took a look at where they are situated, where they are headquartered, you could say. And you see that they're all in the OECD. The only exception is one being headquartered in China. On the right, you see whether they are independent or whether they are hosted by other organizations, and what you see here is that many of the 15 are actually hosted by UN organizations such as UNEP. Okay, now this is maybe not very surprising, but it confirms what we have seen before, that a lot of the non-state activity is an OECD phenomenon. Well, how we interpret this, maybe this is for my conclusions. Let me briefly talk about important actors. So the question that we have asked here is basically, which actors do we want to target to exert influence? Multi-stakeholder partnership. And you can think of this as a way to spread information, also to increase the ambition level if you can influence these actors. And you can also think of those actors being gatekeepers, being in a web, connecting many of those multi-stakeholder partnerships. So these are actors that can make sure that there's a certain alignment of goals and ambitions of those multi-stakeholder partnerships. On the one hand, these actors could also actually stand in the way of alignment of goals of multi-stakeholder partnerships. So the question was for us, who are those important actors? And they are on the left. So that's also maybe not too surprising that we see some governments popping up frequently: the UK, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, and a number of familiar non-governmental organizations such as the WWF, TERI, or the World Resource Institute, and, for example, again, UNEP. So in the end, something that looks quite complex can be reduced to a number of key actors. And again, this is good news on the one hand, because then influence is easy to achieve, you could argue. It's also maybe a problem because very few actors actually control a phenomenon that many believe to be crucial in achieving a low emission development in the future. Now, I also want to say something about the past track record of multi-stakeholder partnerships. So currently we're doing research on those in our climate sample, but we don't have results yet. So I want to refer to research that we have done on partnerships for sustainable development. So these are partnerships that have been originally negotiated in 2002 at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. And these partnerships have been around for a while, so we could perform research on them. And what you see here is basically that 38% of the partnerships we have analyzed, the total sample was around 350, don't have any tangible activities that you could detect. So they're basically paper tigers. The remaining ones, some of them have tangible outputs, so they do things, write reports, organize meetings, implement concrete activities, but these outputs do not match their self-reported functions. So some partnerships have goals that do not match what they actually do on the ground, which raises some concerns. And there are some which have a total positive match, so they actually do what they promise to do. And the baseline here is that this is not a very positive assessment. So past research shows that multi-stakeholder partnerships are by best estimate dubious. And there are a lot of questions raised about them, particularly how you actually monitor, how you verify, and how you report what they have promised. A theme that will come back in the discussions on the phenomenon of non-state actors in climate governance. Now I want to conclude with some of the lessons learned from this overview of some of the research we've been doing. Now this have been snapshots in a sense to trigger your interest, but also your critical questions. Now what we see on the positive side is, Oscar mentioned it, that indeed confirming also what the UNEP study has recently shown, there is a huge potential for emissions reductions. So there's around 1/3 of the estimated gap potentially could be closed by non-state actor activities. Of course, here the emphasis is on potentially could be, because also see a quite dynamic, innovative, and experimental sector. In other words, we see novel ideas emerging, and this is surely why there is so much positive attention to this. Also on the positive side, we see several registries, several data, such as the NASCA, the Non-State Actor Zone for Climate Action we have been referring to. And this is good because actually we believe to see really the whole phenomenon by looking at different ways to conceptualize in different registries. Now on the negative side, and this was very evident in our sample of cities, there are diverging ambition levels, various baselines, various target years, so it makes it very difficult to compare. So that also means that any overly ambitious and overly positive assessment must be questioned, because it always begs the question, against what can we measure this? This brings me to another problem, is that in the current system of non-state activities, which is basically unregulated and bottom-up, we have very weak monitoring and reporting. So this is something we see back with the companies. Even those companies in our sample, 600, that participate in mitigation arrangements with a clear ambition to mitigate emissions, only 25% of those report on their own emissions, which raises serious concerns about, I would argue, the level of sincerity and commitment. So if you preach, then you should also act on this, at least partially. Now, coming back to a third criticism is basically a flip side of me saying that there are several registries, and that's a good thing. It also means that there are various accounting frameworks all over the place. At an individual level, for example, companies choose different metrics to report their emissions. So even those 25% of our sample that do report use different reporting frameworks, which again makes it quite difficult to ascertain what is going on. We think that there are three key components to remedy some of those shortcomings and to ensure that non-state activity can be a meaningful contribution to Paris and beyond. Transparency. To identify progress and avoid greenwashing, we do need baseline agreements on transparency with every non-state actor, and each of those arrangements should actually be able to report. We have to make sure that we see finality. So in other words, to bring cities actually contribute and what they pledge to do is already part of what countries report, or whether it is indeed additional. And here, actually, different people have different opinions, and it's not so easy to close an opinion on this. So we need to make sure that what we see in the non-state realm is indeed additional. And in the end, a crucial point, and that comes out of all of the three analyses we presented, we see quite a biased picture. We see that who is engaging are northern cities, are OECD companies, and multi-stakeholder partnerships, which are indeed headquartered at least in European countries. Now, this might not be a problem because you could argue that it is indeed in the north where most emissions are, where also capability is greatest and also the innovative potential. But on the other hand, if non-state actors are to be seen not only as an effective, but also as a fair and equitable solution, in other words, if we want to have buy-in, then we need to ensure a fairer representation in those initiatives. So in other words, to conclude this slide, we see many shades of gray. We are slightly positive about the phenomenon, but we're quite concerned about the level of variation in terms of scopes, ambitions, reporting frameworks. So what we could discuss, and what we hope to bring out in the next months when we move to Paris, is ideas how to mainstream this, how to bring this closer together, to have some minimum criteria to actually ensure that this sizable contribution, again, 10,000 organizations participating in our sample, that this is not just a window dressing exercise. Now, by saying this, I want to thank you for your attention, and we're very much looking forward to any questions that you might have.
Great, Philip, Oscar, thank you. There's a lot to explore there, and it's very rich. I want to clarify that the presentations will be available on the Subnational Integration Working Group website, which is ledsgp.org. And Philip and Oscar, we have a few questions here that I'd like to go over. Some of them are direct questions. Some of them I think are more philosophical, but I think it would be great with your experience here and you know, the fresh soil still on your hands here from this research, if you know, you could share with us some of your insights. And one of those concerns the Africa continent, and that there's still some INDCs that are expected to come from Africa. And you had shown in the private sector some of the few companies in the African continent. Are they also counting their emissions? What's some of the private sector activity from the Africa continent? How does that compare to the INDCs that will be coming from Africa?
Okay, Philip, you wanna?
Yeah, I can. Thanks. It's a great question. I mean, the general observation is that that Africa is underrepresented in our sample in terms of cities, but also in terms of companies. That those few companies that participate are, and that's also not a surprise, situated mainly in South Africa. So this confirms, of course, some structural observations that we have about, you know, the world economy and these kind of things. But it also, I think, confirms that the drive that we see in on-site action is really a Western, an OECD, a Northern drive, if you may say so. And how individual contributions from companies in Africa compare to the INDCs of African companies, we have not done that exercise. But I think it's actually a great question, and it's quite easy to insert this. Again, I want to refer to the study that we're finalizing now, hopefully be ready in October, in early October, where we will have a much broader and in-depth discussion of non-state actor activities, and I'm sure to include this question. So I take this as a remark and basically as an assignment to do some research and to deliver on this. So thanks for this.
Another pointed question, which is, what do you believe is driving the private sector commitments in Belgium? Why is Belgium standing out?
Why is Belgium standing out?
Correct.
Okay. Did we have yes. I think, I'm not sure if I saw Belgium standing out as one of the headquarters, perhaps. Maybe, wait, I will show back to the slide. Maybe that works. Oh yeah, wait. But I think in general, why we see Yeah. Sorry, it's on number 4 on the Belgium. I think this, for me, this has maybe something to do with not has to do with climate change per se, but maybe with how tax benefits are organized. It's a little bit out of my expertise, but it's when we do this check for where companies actually are situated, maybe it's a good overview of how especially multinational companies are situated globally, in the United States, Japan, United Kingdom, Belgium, for example, because the majority of the companies that we have in our samples are indeed multinational to some or less extent. They need to have some kind of capacity. They need to have some interest. They need to have exposure to climate issues beyond just being vulnerable in their supply chains. They also might be vulnerable to some kind of publicity, or what we have, for example, genuine interest from business leaders in climate change as something that's interesting to or important for a company to deal with. So while Belgium is up there, I think has more to do with being part of a certain place where companies put their headquarters than to actually be especially interested in having climate active companies. Philip, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, very briefly. I think one way to check this is to compare the INDCs of various countries against sort of this plot of headquartered companies, because there's the argument that companies basically react to ambitious targets of governments, or you can also say they maybe drive ambitious targets. It depends a bit how you want to tell the story, but that is also one way we could combine the data and something we can think about.
So some of the questions relate to scaling up, and in your snapshot and identification of these super agents, did you see any lessons learned on how to engage the rest of these companies and non-state actors not yet included in these initiatives, especially from the Global South? Any clear drivers of change that can be replicated?
Yeah, this is a great question. Again, I think a concept that is discussed in more academic circles is the one of orchestrators. So that refers to organizations, usually international organizations, UNEP being a great example, that act as orchestrators. So they have problems directly targeting the targets they want to influence. So they use intermediaries to do their work in a sense. So UNEP is part of many of those initiatives, and it surely has the capacity to engage companies, but also countries. So I think it's those particularly well-situated international organizations that we, on the one hand, can look for. These are important in the sense that they have the experience, they have also the trust. Trust is an important issue to scale up. Now, of course, on the other hand, UNEP is a good example of also the problems that come with this situation, is that they are perceived to be neutral agents and they are not necessarily driving their own agenda. Something that we also see in relation to the UNCCC Secretariat, who has been, in the beginning, I would say, active in this debate with their own database on so-called ICIs, International Cooperative Initiatives, which has sort of died out a bit, and because the UNFCCC argued that it becomes too political. So I think there's always this catch that it's actually IOs, international organizations, that could be scaling up, but they need the mandate to do that. So in the end, there's a certain problem here because states need to be on board. And we see a clear dividing line in terms of state interests on NSAs. Basically, again, the West, the North being in favor, and I'm not mistaken, also some G77 countries taking out text on NSAs in the documents that we're having on the table right now. So this is what is a great question and not easy to overcome.
And so are there any insights you have then on ways to perhaps ensure additionality of these commitments and impacts of non-state actors, additionality to the state parties?
One of the discussions on the table is, of course, some sort of repository, some sort of database which would unite all of those commitments and would have some minimum criteria, in a sense, an entry requirement would be that you use the same metrics for reporting, that you agree on baselines and on target years, so that there's a certain streamlining process going on, something that has been proposed by the research community, by the NGO community, but of course is difficult to get into the negotiations because many parties to the UNFCCC perceive this as additional bureaucracy. There needs to be sort of discussions on all these sort of metrics and stuff. So it's technical, it's bureaucratic, and I think there might be a point that this is putting a limit on the innovative potential of those. So there's always this balance between the bottom-up idea that we want to have innovative sort of fast-tracking initiatives, and then on the other hand, the necessity to put some brakes on there, to put some rules there. But I'm surely to make sure that there's additionality, we would need such a repository with some standard baselines.
Philip, Oscar, we have a few questions to go that are very rich. I realize we're at the hour. Are you still available for another 10 or 15 minutes?
Yeah, we're good. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so that last answer is I think deserves to be unpacked a little bit. And one of the sharp questions we have here is that you concluded that these subnational and non-state actor initiatives, they don't necessarily measure progress or deliver results, and so that leaves two approaches. One could be to make them stronger, and the other approach being to make them irrelevant by implementing more aggressive regulatory approaches. And so perhaps the goal of subnational integration initiatives to increase subnational integration would be first to advocate for strong national and international action, and not in fact or not least not just to deliver results. Do you think that could be an accurate assessment? Is that a possible recommendation for a way forward?
Look, I mean, one of my, I think you can't have, for me, I mean, what Philip said before is one of these ideas, at least in the research community, and I think it has a lot of truth to it, is that just the shadow of regulation, the threat of the plausibility of regulations drive actions by the ones who are supposed to be regulated, right? So if you can, let's say, evade strong regulation by showing your commitment and coming up with your own rules, and we've seen this many times in, for example, voluntary environmental agreements by companies, especially in the US, doing great work on this, and we've seen really interesting, dynamic, kind of flexible solutions coming out of this. So it really shows this interaction, and I think we have much proof for it, this interaction between just the threat or the plausibility of a strong policy or target or regulation that actually drives change. So some would then even argue maybe you don't even need it, you just need the threat. But having that said, it's interesting, and I find it very interesting, because many, especially the company commitments that we find in NASCA, are quite new. And there you see things like, for example, putting a price on carbon, right? So something that came out of New York last year, this idea that I think it was over 1,000 companies saying we want a price on carbon. But what does that mean? And how will that actually play out? And how will the companies actually try to commit to this? And will countries respond to that? And that, I think, is something that has to be played out if that commitment actually means has a substance to it, right? But I'm not sure. I would love to say no. We can actually. I know that actors seems to be doing this very well on their own, not complementing, not substituting, but at least complementing the UNFCCC. Sometimes straddling kind of process. But I do think that, of course, at least of strong regulation is something that really drives change, also in both among cities and companies. I don't know. Yeah.
So to reverse that, or the inverse of that, how specifically do you think these non-state actions can increase the ambition of state commitments to the UNFCCC?
Yeah, difficult question. I think that there is a bit of a blame game going on. That's at least one of the risks of this discussion, because states say, look, there's so much going on, we don't need to worry really. This gap will be closed because there's all this great stuff, and we put up a database and we can show 3,000 commitments, and it looks glossy and nice. So then that puts away the pressure from concrete binding mitigation action. On the other hand, if you just say, look, this is all window dressing, this is pure nonsense, then I think you also discredit those initiatives which have already shown on the ground that change can be implemented without top-down support, in particular, overcoming some of the problems of international stalemate and national stalemate. So I think there is a bit of this catch-22 problem that neither solution, so only looking at international sort of discussions, nor just thinking that it will be a miraculous bottom-up will do. And I know that's maybe not comforting everyone if you want to have a clear position, but I think we have to, in a sense, if I might use strong language, weed out those things which are clear window dressing and greenwashing, and to keep those which make a meaningful contribution. And then I think the non-state activities can be part of a solution.
You know, that brings up a question, and that is around the emergence and discussions here about climate clubs and their potential to sort of address the free rider problem. Could you briefly sort of summarize some of those discussions on climate clubs, some of the objectives of the promoters, of the people who believe that climate clubs deserve to be part of the discussion? Is that something you're familiar with, and where is some of the best information coming from?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. We've written much on it, and I think the first thing I want to point to if people who are interested in this, there's been a great paper by a guy called Robert Faulkner. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, you know, summarizing some of these discussions, which is very interesting, showing that this idea of also minilateralisms, climate clubs actually have several aspects to it. So we tend to speak of climate clubs as one subject, but it's actually several different types of proposals that are out there. So you have some people saying a climate club is, for example, between, you know, a coalition of the willing. So you have a few companies, a few countries coming together that actually want to do something. They move ahead of the rest, and they have internal agreement of going faster. So you almost have a two-track approach, right? That are maybe separate from the UNFCCC. You can also say, look, we have a climate club which has where countries can join, but that is actually linked to the UNFCCC, right? So that the thing that they do there actually accounts for in the UNFCCC. The last, maybe more interesting in the context of our discussions, is this idea of having climate clubs which involve both states and non-state actors. And this is, at least from my kind of interpretation of how the negotiations have been going in the last few COPs, but also especially over the last year, now having been in Bonn the last time, I don't know how it's going in Lima now, but to see how there are some countries that are very pro this idea of involving non-state actors more, how some other countries, especially maybe developing world countries, for maybe plausible reasons, as we've seen throughout this presentation, are more kind of skeptical to the idea of involving non-state actors more in climate clubs. I think the idea that we can build on some of the clubs that are already out there, if you want to call them clubs. Think about the CCAC, for example, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which has, you know, really brought both countries and non-state actors, especially research institutes and NGOs together to kind of create this unique group of actors that work in a multi-stakeholder way to promote a very specific technology or problem, let's say. So you start to unbundle, let's say, the climate problem from being one large problem to many small problems, and then create clubs around them. And there's been several kind of suggestions like this from Building Blocks, for example, which we can send around. But I find that a very interesting idea, to where you say that depending on what problem we have, if it's about, for example, urban mitigation, then we should bring in the most appropriate actors, and that should then be non-state actors. Whereas in other cases, it might not be appropriate to bring in non-state actors.
Philip, what was the reference for that paper again, the author and source?
So the author, the first I mentioned was Robert Faulkner, and I think it's a working paper, and he's at the London School of Economics and the Grantham Institute, and it's called something with minilateralism. I would have to double check exactly what it's called, and I can send it around. Okay,
thanks. So then, are there other options you've come across, or that you would recommend for coordinating and orchestrating NSAs at an international level, similar to what the UNFCCC process? How would that work?
Yeah, there are several ongoing initiatives from the research community to create data sets, basically to upscale, to invigorate what they call the groundswell. There's a group of people, including Thomas Hale and Sander Chan and others, who sort of advocate this from the scientific community. But of course, yeah, this is sort of an uphill struggle. It's an idea to have, as I mentioned, some ground rules and some unified repository. I think that is one way to get more traction here. And the other is, of course, what the French presidency is actually doing, is saying that there will be some sort of pillar, then that's called the fourth pillar, some sort of arena in which this whole non-state activity can be displayed, where lessons learned can be taken, and where sort of forward scoping can be done. And I think a combination of those two is actually a good strategy. Just one word on the club idea. I think one keyword that we have to throw in is, of course, legitimacy. I think a key problem with the whole club discussion is that many actors perceive this genuinely to be illegitimate, and that will create all sorts of repercussions. So even if clubs move ahead, there is a potential scenario that those actors left behind, because they don't accept that as a legitimate strategy, will sort of try to derail these processes. And this is a serious problem, I would argue. So I think climate clubs can only move so far as they can ensure a certain basic legitimacy of what they do. And this has not been proven, actually, so far. So it's a very theoretical discussion in a sense.
Just to finish that, mainly also because we still have a lot of discussions on climate clubs. We still have to see a climate club which is proving to do everything it's supposed to do. Right? We have seen, for example, the Asia Pacific Partnership a few years ago was one type of this climate club attempts, which in the end maybe didn't yield that much, but at least was trying to, following much of the design rules which I said has been discussed.
That's great. That's great. And a couple final questions. What about the theme of carbon sequestration? Did you come across any NSAs who were making commitments to sequester carbon?
Very little. I mean, the CCS debate. I mean, think about it that you have CCS, especially coming out of, especially coming from Europe, for example, has very diminished in terms of interest, for example, since the technology in many cases doesn't seem to attract the public funding and yield the kind of the effects that you want. So from our perspective, at least from my perspective, I see very little in the transnational climate, among the transnational climate initiatives, also among business, where CCS is something that is put to the forefront of as a future solution.
That's great. And then we have a final question here, Philip and Oscar, and that is, which one of you has the smaller carbon footprint?
Well, I don't know.
Given that I hate flying, I guess it is me, because I tend to walk, cycle, or take the train. But of course, maybe we need to go to a website and have this estimated. And there are a couple of websites where we can do that.
When I earn more, I'm gonna have a bigger one. No. I think we're pretty moderate, on the lower side, I hope.
And if I might make this comment, I think also because this fantastic technology of having webinars is available, I think it's a very useful experience also for researchers like us to be able to share ideas with an audience which is not physically present, and so we don't have to go to conferences all the way.
That's right, and policymakers don't need to read journals, so that's a great thing.
They don't need to print them at least.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for those efforts. I want to remind everybody that we'll be posting the PowerPoints here on the Subnational Integration LEDS GP website. We'll also have a recording of this webinar today. Oscar, Philip, I really appreciate your efforts here. Thank you. It was a very rich presentation. We're going to conclude here with a quick poll that comes up on your screen, I believe. And if you could please answer those questions, that'd be very helpful. I think the person who completes it the fastest will get a all-expenses paid trip to the LEDS GP annual event in Punta Cana, but I may be wrong on that. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, everyone, that concludes our webinar. Thank you, and best wishes for success in all your important work. Thanks.